It was July of 1944. Normandy still smelled of turned earth and burnt metal. The morning sun pierced the dust suspended in the air, creating shafts of light that cut through the heavy silence of the French countryside. Around the village of Saint-Lô, medium tank M403, Sherman tanks formed a ragged line, some standing still like monuments, others being repaired by greasy hands. Before we continue, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this video from right now? Comment below with your city or country. It's always impressive to see how far these stories reach across the globe. Now, let's go back to that day, where it all began. The U.S. Army's 3rd Armored Division faced a problem not covered in Washington's manuals. Since landing on the beaches of France 6 weeks earlier, the Sherman crews had learned a bitter truth: their tanks burned too quickly. Too quickly. The unofficial nickname was already circulating quietly among the soldiers. Ronson, like lighters that lit on the first try, always. German Panzer V. Panther tanks and Pak-40 anti-tank guns pierced the Sherman's frontal armor with technical ease, and the result was almost always the same. Flames, black smoke spiraling upward, crews abandoning their vehicles in despair or never leaving them again. The numbers didn't lie. Of every 5 Shermans hit by German shells, 4 caught fire immediately. The ammunition stored inside the hull, the 65-75mm grenades stacked without adequate protection, turned each tank into a mobile bomb waiting for the right fuse. The crews knew this. They felt the weight of this certainty every time they closed the hatch, every time they heard the distant whistling of an enemy shell cutting through the air. The fear wasn't of combat, it was of fire. Of the heat that melted metal and consumed everything in seconds. It was of the impossibility of escape when the flames rose faster than human reaction. Commanders tried everything. Orders were issued for crews to carry less ammunition, 30 grenades instead of 65, but this meant less firepower, less combat time, and less chance of surviving a prolonged confrontation. Some tanks received additional armor plates welded onto the front, improvised solutions made in field workshops. The extra weight slowed the engines, fuel consumption soared, and mobility, the Sherman's only real advantage, disappeared. Official solutions didn't solve the problem. They merely shifted the problem. It was against this backdrop that a man began to survey the wreckage. He wasn't a general. He didn't command battalions or plan offensives on maps. His name was Curtis G. Culin, Jr., born and raised in Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he worked as a mechanic in a regular shop, repairing civilian cars, tuning engines, welding chassis. Nothing glamorous. Nothing strategic, but he understood metal. He understood weight, resistance, pressure. He understood what worked and what broke. And now, as a corporal in the 2nd Armored Battalion, he saw tanks every day. Tanks running, tanks idling, tanks burning. Culin noticed something others overlooked. Normandy's roads were lined with ancient hedgerows, living walls of compacted earth and intertwined roots, some over 3 meters high. The French called them bocages. To American tanks, they were death traps. When a Sherman attempted to climb one of these natural barriers, the front would rise, exposing the unprotected belly of the hull, its weakest part. It was the perfect moment for a hidden German sniper with a Panzerfaust or an anti-tank gun, a well-aimed shot to the underside. Instant fire. Another Sherman lost. But Culin also observed captured German tanks. Some Panzer IVs had welded metal structures at the front, steel teeth that broke through obstacles, cut through barbed wire, and opened passages where there were none. He began to think. Not in terms of doctrine, not in terms of reports or hierarchy. He thought like a mechanic. If the problem was the nose's elevation when climbing hedges, the solution was to keep the tank's nose low. And if there were a structure that cut through the barrier instead of climbing it, the Sherman would pass straight through, without exposing its lower hull. The idea was simple, too simple to be official. But Culin didn't wait for authorization. He took scrap metal from the beach obstacles left by the Germans, the anti-tank structures known as dragon's teeth. He cut, he welded, he adjusted angles. He created a set of tooth-shaped blades that could be attached to the front of a Sherman. He tested it on an abandoned tank. It worked. The metal cut through the hedgerow like butter. The tank passed through without raising its nose. The news reached the ears of General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army. He watched the demonstration, silent, analytical. When the test was over, Bradley didn't ask for reports. He ordered immediate production. 3 days later, every field workshop in Normandy was manufacturing the device. Soldiers called it the Cullen cutter, or simply the Rhino hedge cutter. Within 2 weeks, 60% of the Shermans in Normandy were equipped. The impact was immediate. August 1944. Operation Cobra was underway. The US First Army was advancing deep into France, breaking through the German defensive lines that had held the Allies back for weeks in the suffocating Normandy hedgerows. The Sherman tanks, now equipped with Cullen cutters, moved differently, no longer slow, hesitant, vulnerable as they climbed every natural barrier. Now they were driving through, directly, fast, unpredictable to the enemy. The crews noticed the change before their commanders did. It wasn't just the ability to cut through the hedges, it was the confidence. Corporal John T. Matheson, a gunner on a Sherman in the 4th Armored Division, would later describe in his personal diary the sensation of crossing a barrier that would previously have been a guaranteed execution point. He wrote that the sound of metal cutting through earth and roots was loud, aggressive, almost comforting. It signified movement. It signified that they weren't standing still, waiting for the inevitable impact of a German shell from some unseen corner of the landscape. But Cullen's cutter only solved part of the problem. The Shermans were still burning. They still carried unprotected ammunition. They were still vulnerable to the Pak-40 and Panther guns that dominated the open fields beyond the hedgerows. Mobility had improved, but survival remained a gamble. Curtis Cullen knew this. He watched the tanks return from patrols, scarred by impacts, some smoking, others completely lost. He saw the silent crews, their faces covered in soot, their eyes distant. He saw the fear that no order could erase. Cullen looked again. This time, his focus wasn't the front of the tank, but the interior. He began examining the wrecked Shermans being towed back to the lines. He climbed inside the still hot burned hulls, the smell of melted metal and charred rubber permeating everything. He studied where enemy shells had penetrated. He measured the angles. He identified the ignition points. In most cases, the fire started in the same area, the underside of the hull, where the 75mm grenades were stored on open shelves, separated only by thin metal partitions. A German armor-piercing shell penetrating the side armor directly hit this ammunition. The secondary explosion that followed was devastating. The tank's interior turned into a furnace in less than 3 seconds. There was no time to react, no time to open hatches. The crew was consumed before understanding what had happened. Cullen wrote everything down, not in technical military jargon, but in practical workshop terms. The problem wasn't the external armor, it was the internal arrangement. It was the lack of protection around the ammunition. He presented the idea to his battalion commander, Major Harold L. Cohen. The proposal was straightforward: create armored compartments around the ammunition racks. Reinforced steel boxes would enclose each row of grenades, isolating them from the rest of the hull. If an enemy projectile penetrated the side, it would strike the additional armor before reaching the ammunition. The impact would be contained. Fire, if it occurred, would be localized and controllable. The crew would have time to evacuate. Cohen listened in silence. He was a career officer, a West Point graduate, trained to follow established procedures, but he was also pragmatic. He had lost 12 tanks in 2 weeks, 12 crews. Some of the men he knew by name, by face, by the stories they told during the cold nights in the makeshift camps. He authorized a test, unofficial, undocumented, just a field experiment. Cullen chose a Sherman M4A3 that had been hit from the side but hadn't caught fire, a rare occurrence. He removed the original ammunition racks. He cut armor plates from destroyed German tanks, a higher quality metal than that used in the Shermans. He welded these plates together to form boxes around each grenade pack. The work took 3 days. He didn't sleep well in any of them. He welded at night, under dark tarps to hide the torchlight because the German positions weren't far away. During the day, he tested weight, distribution, and accessibility. The boxes couldn't be so heavy that they slowed the tank down. They couldn't be so closed that they prevented the loader from quickly retrieving the grenades during combat. When finished, the tank looked the same on the outside, but on the inside, it was different. Cullen persuaded a veteran crew to test it. They took the modified Sherman to a controlled training area, where simulated targets and captured German shells were used to test its durability. A captured Pak-40 shell was fired into the side of the tank, exactly where the ammunition was stored. The impact echoed like a dry thunderclap. The external armor was pierced. The shell entered, but stopped dead in the wall of the internal armored box. The ammunition was not hit. There was no secondary explosion. There was no fire. The crew emerged from the tank unharmed, shocked but alive. The tank commander, Sergeant William R. Donovan, a man of few words who had survived 2 burned-out Shermans before that, looked at Cullen and said only one short sentence: "This works." Major Cohen saw the result and made a decision that violated protocol. He ordered all shops under his command to begin installing the armored boxes on all Shermans in the battalion. He didn't wait for approval from higher up. He didn't send reports to Washington. He knew the bureaucracy would take months. His men didn't have months. September 1944. The Allied offensive was crossing Belgium toward the German border. Modified Shermans of the 2nd Armored Battalion engaged in daily combat against Wehrmacht. Rearguard units attempting to slow the advance. Discrepancies began to appear in the field reports, simple documents filed after each engagement, listing damage, casualties, and effectiveness. The numbers told a story no one had officially anticipated. Of the 28 Shermans equipped with Cullen's internal armor boxes, 23 had been hit by German anti-tank shells during the month of August. Of those 23, only 4 caught fire. 17 crews had escaped alive from tanks that, under normal circumstances, would have become furnaces. Company commanders began to notice. They began to ask, what was the 2nd Battalion doing differently? Why weren't their tanks burning at the same rate as the others? The answer reached Colonel John H. Collier, an engineering officer with the 3rd Armored Division. Collier was methodical, almost obsessive about technical details. He had worked on armored vehicle development before the war and had known the Shermans since the first prototypes tested in Aberdeen, Maryland. When he learned of the unauthorized modifications, his first reaction was predictable: irritation. A mechanical corporal had no authority to alter a tank's design. There were protocols. There were qualified engineers. There were months-long testing procedures, weight assessments, structural stress calculations, and approvals from multiple layers of command. Collier personally inspected one of the modified Shermans. He arrived unannounced, accompanied by 2 engineering lieutenants, expecting to find a makeshift solution that put the crews at risk due to technical ignorance. He climbed inside the tank. He examined the welds. He measured the thickness. He checked the grenade accessibility. He tested the additional weight. He asked direct questions of Curtis Cullen, who was present, still covered in grease, still wearing the ordinary uniform of a corporal, without any special insignia. Cullen responded with technical precision. He explained the weight distribution calculations. He showed how the boxes didn't affect the tank's center of gravity. He demonstrated that ammunition access time had increased by only 2 seconds, meaningless in real combat. He presented the survival figures. Collier said nothing throughout the inspection. He just took notes, just watched. When he finished, he climbed out of the tank, walked a few meters in silence, then turned and looked at Cullen. The question was direct. Why didn't you report this before implementing it? Cullen's answer was equally direct. Because it would take too long and men were dying right now. Collier was silent for a few seconds. Then he did something unexpected. He apologized. He said he was wrong to assume the modification was amateurish. He said the work was technically sound, possibly better than some solutions he himself had seen in official laboratories. And then he made a promise. He would take the idea directly to General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe. 3 weeks later, Curtis Cullen was in Paris, not as a prisoner of a court-martial for violating protocols, as some had whispered he would be, but as a guest at a technical meeting at the headquarters of SHAEF, the Supreme Command of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. He entered a room where generals and engineers were debating armor strategies for the impending invasion of Germany. Cullen, a corporal, sat at a table with men who commanded entire armies. He felt out of place. He felt the weight of their gazes. But when he began to speak, the room fell silent. He didn't use formal military language. He spoke like a mechanic. He explained the ammunition ignition problem as if he were describing a malfunction in an automobile engine. He showed simple, hand-drawn diagrams. He presented the survival data without statistical embellishment. 23 tanks hit, 4 fires, 17 crews alive. The generals asked questions. Cullen answered with technical honesty. He didn't try to impress. He didn't exaggerate. He simply presented what worked. Eisenhower, who had been present but had remained silent, finally spoke. He asked how long it would take to equip every Sherman in Europe with these modifications. Collier replied, "With current resources, 6 months. Eisenhower shook his head. Unacceptable. He wanted 3 months. He wanted every field workshop, every repair base, every supply depot to receive the technical instructions immediately. He wanted this to become standard before winter, before the final offensive in Germany. The order was issued the next day, September 27, 1944. Technical Directive Scheif Bar 341. All medium-tank M4 Sherman tanks in service in the European theatre were to receive internal armoured compartments around the main ammunition. The specifications were based on a design by Curtis Cullen. The document didn't mention his name directly, but the engineers knew. The crews knew. Implementation began immediately. Field workshops in France, Belgium and England received tons of armour plates. Welders worked 12-hour shifts. Tanks arrived, were modified in 2 days, and then returned to combat. The production was industrial, but the origin was human. A man observing wreckage. A man thinking about how to keep other men alive. However, the war didn't stop to wait for technical improvements. While the Shermans were being modified, the fighting continued. Casualties continued, and Curtis Cullen returned to his battalion, returned to the field shop, returned to repairing engines, adjusting tracks and welding metal. He wasn't promoted immediately. He didn't receive medals at that moment. He simply returned to work because there were more tanks to repair, more problems to solve. October 1944. The Western Front had temporarily stabilized along the German border. Autumn rains turned the fields into mud, hampering the advance of armored vehicles. Modified Shermans began arriving in significant numbers among frontline units. Every tank leaving the field workshops now carried 2 modifications not included in the original Detroit design: coolant cutters on the front and internal armored boxes protecting the ammunition. The crews noticed the psychological difference even before the first combat. Lieutenant George M. Patterson, a platoon commander in the 7th Armored Division, would later describe in a letter to his family in Ohio that climbing into a modified Sherman was like donning armor that truly protected, not just symbolically. He wrote that the men spoke differently inside these tanks. Less tense, less resigned. Still afraid, always afraid, but no longer with that silent certainty that a single hit meant certain death. The Germans also began to notice changes in the tactical behavior of American tanks. Captured Wehrmacht intelligence reports later revealed confusion among anti-tank unit commanders. The Shermans were now breaking through barriers that had previously forced them to stop and expose themselves. They were attacking from unexpected angles. Most importantly, even when hit, they didn't burn as often as before. This altered German tactical calculations. Previously, a well-positioned Pak-40 gun could halt an American advance simply by setting fire to the first tanks, creating fire barriers that blocked the remaining ones. Now the hit Shermans often remained operational, or at least their crews were able to break out and occupy infantry positions. Curtis Cullen followed these developments from afar, through conversations with other crews, through informal reports circulated among mechanics and welders. He never sought credit. He never mentioned his role in the modifications when speaking with soldiers from other units. For him, the problem had been identified and resolved. That was enough. But others did not forget. Colonel Collier submitted an official report recommending Cullen for the Legion of Merit, a decoration rarely awarded to soldiers below the rank of officer, reserved for exceptional contributions to the war effort. The process moved slowly through bureaucratic channels, like everything else in the army. Meanwhile, November arrived, bringing snow and preparations for what would become the Battle of the Bulge. The Ardennes, that region of dense forests and narrow valleys on the Belgian-German border, was about to become the stage for the last major German offensive on the Western Front. The modified Shermans would be there, tested no longer in scattered rearguard combat, but in massive battles against the best armored units Germany could still muster. December 16, 1944. The German offensive began before dawn, a desperate push involving 3 entire armies, over 200,000 men, and 1,000 tanks, including the new Panzer VI Tiger IIs, the most heavily armored of the war. The attack caught the American forces unprepared. Entire units were surrounded, supply lines were cut, confusion reigned. For the first 3 days, it seemed as if the Allied front might collapse. The Shermans of the 3rd and 7th Armored Divisions were immediately thrown into battle to stem the advance. Fighting took place at short ranges, on icy roads between the trees, where the American numerical superiority was neutralized by the tight terrain. The German Panthers and Tigers had the advantage in armor and firepower, but the Shermans had mobility and now increased survivability. The combat statistics of the Ardennes would tell a story that fully validated Kulin's work. During the 6 weeks of the Battle of the Bulge, 147 Shermans equipped with internal armored compartments were hit by German anti-tank shells. Of these, 31 caught fire. 116 did not ignite immediately, allowing their crews to either continue fighting or evacuate to safety. By comparison, the unmodified Shermans still in service had fire rates above 80% when penetrated. The difference was not marginal. It was the difference between 300 lives lost and 300 lives saved. But cold numbers didn't capture the human reality. Every tank that didn't burn represented 5 men who returned to their positions, 5 men who could fight another day, 5 men who would eventually return home when the war ended. Sergeant Donovan, the one who had tested the first modified Sherman months earlier, survived 3 direct hits during the Ardennes. His tank was hit near Bastogne, near Saint-Vith, near Houffalize. On each occasion, the German shell penetrated the side armor. On each occasion, the internal shells contained the secondary blast. Donovan and his crew bailed out each time. They repaired the tank twice. The third time, the damage was too severe, but all 5 men were alive to walk to the rear line. Kulin was in a field workshop in Luxembourg for most of the battle, repairing damaged tanks that arrived in a steady stream. He worked under snow-covered tarps, his hands so cold he could barely hold his tools. He welded armor plates, replaced destroyed tracks, and rebuilt steering systems. He wasn't at the front, wasn't firing weapons, wasn't commanding men, but his work was there in every tank he had helped modify, in every crew that survived because their ammunition hadn't exploded. In January 1945, when the German offensive was finally contained and repelled, the Legion of Merit was officially awarded to Corporal Curtis G. Kulin, Jr. The ceremony was brief, held in a freezing field near Liège, Belgium. General Omar Bradley was present. He pinned the medal to Kulin's uniform and said only a few words. "You have saved more lives than most doctors in this war." Kulin didn't know what to say. He simply thanked them and returned to his workshop. February 1945. The war was entering its final phase. The Allied armies crossed the Rhine River, penetrating deep into German territory. Enemy resistance was fierce but disorganized, fighting not for victory, but for time. The modified Shermans continued to advance, crossing open fields, destroyed cities, and burned forests. Kulin's modification had become so standard that new tanks leaving American factories already came equipped with armored compartments around the ammunition, incorporated into the production design. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department had analyzed field data and concluded that the modification increased crew survival by 63% when the tank was penetrated from the side. This figure was extraordinary in military terms. Few technical innovations throughout the war had demonstrated such a direct and measurable impact on saving lives. Engineers in Aberdeen began studying the concept for application in future armored vehicle designs. The principle was simple, but had been ignored. Protecting the ammunition was as important as protecting the crew directly. Curtis Kulin, however, was not present to see the final recognition of his work. In March, he was transferred to an engineering unit preparing bridges and supply routes for the final advance on Berlin. His skills as a mechanic and welder were needed for infrastructure projects, no longer for tank modifications. He worked on rebuilding a bridge over the Weser River near Hamelin, Germany. Hard, technical, invisible work. No report would mention his name, no photograph would be taken, just another soldier doing what needed to be done. The Shermans kept fighting. The 1st Armored Division reached the Elbe River in April, where it would encounter Soviet forces advancing from the east. The 3rd Armored Division engaged in some of the last urban battles of the war, house-to-house fighting in German cities that refused to surrender. In these final engagements, the tanks suffered constant damage. Panzerfausts fired from windows, landmines hidden in rubble, anti-tank guns positioned in basements. But the crews of the modified Shermans continued to emerge alive in numbers that would have been impossible a year earlier. Lieutenant Patterson, the one who had written to his family in Ohio about the psychological differences of modified tanks, survived the war. His Sherman was hit 7 times between October 1944 and May 1945. It burned only once on the final impact, but the entire crew managed to evacuate. Patterson would return to the United States in June, be demobilized in August, return to his hometown, marry, have 3 children, and work as a high school history teacher. He would never forget Curtis Cullen's name. He would mention it in his classes decades later, when teaching about World War II. He would tell his students that sometimes wars are won not by generals, but by thinking mechanics. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe officially ended. Curtis Cullen was at a temporary engineering base near Kassel, working to clear debris from a bombed-out railway station. When the news arrived, the soldiers around him screamed, hugged, and cried. Cullen simply stopped working, sat down on a pile of broken bricks, lit a cigarette, and was silent for a few minutes. He thought of all the field workshops, all the burned-out tanks he had seen, all the soot-covered faces. He wondered if he had made enough of a difference. The answer would come through numbers he would never see officially compiled. During the 11 months between the initial implementation of the modifications and the end of the war, approximately 4,000 Shermans were fitted with internal armored compartments based on his design. Of these, 1,200 were hit by enemy anti-tank shells. 920 did not catch fire, allowing the survival of approximately 4,600 crew members who, statistically, would have died had they been in unmodified tanks. 4,600 men, 4,600 names in military records, 4,600 who returned home. But Cullen wasn't thinking in thousands. He was thinking in individual faces, of Sergeant Donovan, who had tested the first tank and survived 3 hits, of Private Raymond Fisher, a 19-year-old loader from Milwaukee who climbed out of a stricken Sherman near Cologne and simply said thank you before walking to the rear, of Lieutenant Michael Kowalski, a tank commander who wrote a letter to Cullen after the war, saying that his wife and newborn son existed because a mechanic corporal had observed wreckage and thought of solutions. Curtis Cullen was demobilized in September 1945. He returned to Cranford, New Jersey. He returned to the auto repair shop where he had worked before the war. The owner, a man named Herbert Thompson, still kept the business running. He offered Cullen his job back. Same job, same pay, repairing cars, adjusting brakes, changing oil, welding chassis. Cullen accepted. He didn't seek fame. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write memoirs. He simply returned to the work he knew how to do. The Legion of Merit was kept in a drawer. He rarely mentioned the war. When asked by clients or neighbors about his military service, he would answer briefly, "I worked with tanks, nothing more." People interpreted this as modesty or perhaps trauma. It was neither. It was simply that Cullen didn't see his work as exceptional. He saw it as necessary. He saw it as something anyone with technical knowledge and access to resources could have done. He was wrong in this assessment of himself, but he would never change his mind. The years following the war brought silence to many stories that deserved to be told. Curtis Cullen lived an ordinary life in Cranford, working in Herbert Thompson's auto shop for 3 decades. In 1947, he married Margaret Ann Sullivan, a nurse who had served with the Red Cross during the war. They had 2 children, James and Patricia. They bought a modest house on a tree-lined street. Cullen fixed cars during the day, tended the garden on weekends, and watched baseball games on the radio. A completely normal life, exactly how he wanted it, but the U.S. Army hadn't forgotten. In the Ordnance Department archives, technical reports detailed the evolution of modifications to the Sherman tanks. Cullen's name appeared in classified documents, in studies on armor effectiveness, and in crew survival analyses. Military engineers studied his principles while developing the new M46 Patton and M48 tanks, which would enter service in the 1950s. The concept of storing ammunition in separate armored compartments became standard in all subsequent American designs. The innovation of a mechanical cable had become official doctrine. In 1958, a young military historian named Robert L. Wagner was researching World War II technical innovations for his doctoral dissertation at Princeton University. He found references to Sherman modifications in recently declassified documents. He found Curtis Cullen's name. He found the address in Cranford. Wagner knocked on Cullen's door one October afternoon, introduced himself and explained his research. Cullen greeted him politely but reluctantly. He didn't have much to say, he explained. He had simply done his job. Wagner persisted. He spent 3 afternoons talking with Cullen in the living room of that ordinary house, drinking coffee prepared by Margaret, asking technical questions, and jotting down short, precise answers. Kulin didn't like to talk about the war, but he did like to talk about mechanics, welding, and engineering principles. Wagner captured this unique perspective in his thesis, which would later be published as a book. The chapter on Sherman modifications was simply titled Innovation Under Fire, the story of Curtis Kulin. The book had a limited circulation, mostly academic, but it reached veterans who had served in armored units. Letters began arriving at Cranford, dozens of them, then hundreds. Men who had driven modified Shermans, men who had survived because their tanks hadn't burned, men who simply wanted to say thank you to someone they would likely never know had saved their lives. Cullen read every letter. He responded to some. Most he kept in a shoebox in his closet, without showing them to anyone. One such letter came from General William C. Westmoreland, who had commanded artillery units in Europe during the war and was now a prominent figure in the Pentagon. Westmoreland wrote that he had reviewed the complete survival figures and concluded that Cullen's modifications represented one of the most significant individual contributions to the preservation of American lives during the entire war. He invited Cullen to a ceremony in Washington where he would be formally recognized. Cullen politely declined. He said he had already received his medal. He said he disliked ceremonies. He said he preferred to stay home. But the story began to circulate. Military magazines published articles. Television documentaries about World War II began to include segments on technical innovations, and Kulin's name appeared briefly. Veterans began seeking him out in person. They would show up at the workshop where he worked, asking only to shake his hand. Cullen was always embarrassed by the attention. He always deflected credit. He claimed many people had worked on the modifications. He said he had only just begun. Others had perfected them. He never accepted being called a hero. In 1963, the Armored Vehicle Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, opened a permanent exhibit on the evolution of the Sherman tank. One of the vehicles on display was an M4A3 with Cullen's original modifications, one of the few preserved intact after the war. An explanatory plaque described the history. It mentioned that the innovation had saved thousands of lives. It also included his full name, Corporal Curtis G. Cullen, Jr. The museum invited Cullen to the unveiling. This time he accepted. It was the only time after the war that he saw a Sherman again. He walked around the tank in silence, touched the armor, and looked inside through the open hatch. He stood there for 15 minutes without saying anything. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were moist, but his face remained serene. Curtis Cullen died in 1986, at the age of 73, of natural causes, at his home in Cranford. The funeral was small, attended by just family and a few close friends, but the Army sent an honor guard. 6 veterans of the 3rd Armored Division, all in their 60s, traveled from different states to be present. They didn't know each other, but they all shared the same story. They had served in modified Shermans. They had survived because their tanks didn't burn. They owed their lives, directly or indirectly, to a man who had never sought recognition. Curtis Kulin's story didn't end with his death. It continued in military engineering manuals. It continued in military academy classrooms, where cadets study cases of innovation under pressure. It continued in museums, where visitors gaze at old tanks and read about the mechanical corporal who thought differently. But most importantly, it continued in the lives he saved, in the children born because fathers returned from war, in the grandchildren who exist because grandfathers climbed out of burning tanks, in the generations that followed, linked by an invisible thread to a man who observed wreckage and decided to do something about it. The lesson remains relevant. War, for all its brutality and chaos, is sometimes transformed not by grand strategies or generals' decisions, but by individuals who see problems and create solutions with the tools at hand. Curtis Kulin didn't invent the Sherman tank. He didn't redesign armored doctrine. He didn't command armies. He simply looked at a technical problem that was killing people and applied practical knowledge to solve it. He did so without prior authorization. He did so because lives depended on speed, not bureaucracy. And in doing so, he proved that the most significant contribution doesn't always come from the top, but often from the bottom, where men and women face the direct reality of combat and have the courage to act. Final numbers have never been fully compiled, but conservative estimates suggest that between 4,000 and 5,000 Sherman crew members survived impacts that would have been fatal without Kulin's modifications. 5,000 lives, 5,000 stories. 5,000 futures that existed because a New Jersey mechanic thought there was a better way to protect ammunition. If you've made it this far, if this story touched you in any way, please like this video. Comment on what you thought of this incredible tale of innovation and survival. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now to hear more forgotten stories from World War II, stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things when humanity faced its darkest hour. These stories need to be remembered, they need to be told, and you, by watching, commenting, and sharing, help keep them alive. Thanks for being here. See you in the next story.